I was 16 and in search of a new gaming PC to purchase on Craigslist. I had just gotten my first job and wanted to reward myself after receiving my first paycheck. I spent a lot of time online every day after work, browsing through various listings. Eventually, I came across an intriguing offer: a 3-year-old Alienware with decent specifications, priced at only $200. The seller mentioned in the description that they had recently upgraded to a newer PC and no longer needed this one, but assured that it still functions perfectly fine. I reached out to him via email and received a prompt response. We engaged in a series of messages, discussing our plans before deciding to meet up the following day. I was instructed to rendezvous with him at a designated grocery store parking lot at 8:00 p.m. It was quite a distance away, so I proposed an alternative location where we could meet halfway. However, he came up with a series of excuses for why he couldn't do that. He claimed to be busy all week and unable to travel far. He insisted that if I wanted it, I would have to pick it up near him. Although I found this a bit frustrating, I still believed the deal was worthwhile and agreed to pick it up in the morning. I pondered the situation further and almost decided to cancel the arrangement. However, he sent me a few videos to demonstrate that the PC was functioning properly. He also assured me that if any problems arose, he would provide a refund. This reassured me, so I proceeded with the purchase, even though it required a 35-mile drive. Minutes away from the grocery store, he instructed me to meet him right as I pulled into the parking lot. I noticed a truck parked in the far corner of the parking lot, standing alone amidst the darkness. The grocery store's lights were eerily off, giving the impression that it had already closed down. It struck me as odd, considering that meeting at a grocery store was supposed to be a safe and public location. It seemed like the purpose of choosing this place was being undermined. Despite having driven for almost 40 minutes, I decided to pull in and hope for the best. I parked by his truck and got out. The man sitting inside leaned over and looked down from his window. He didn't acknowledge my presence at all. His gaze was fixed downwards, as if he was scrutinizing every inch of me. It sent shivers down my spine, making me feel incredibly uneasy. Stepping out of the vehicle, he revealed himself to be an older man, perhaps in his late 40s or 52nds. His thinning brown hair and a brief glance at his face gave off an unsettling vibe. I instinctively kept my distance, standing a few feet away as he proceeded to wander around and unlock the back door of the car. I could see the computer sitting there, silently waiting. On the seat, but not the one closest to us. It was on the other seat, further inside the truck. He then pointed into the truck and said I could take it out and look at it. His hand was still on the door, and he just watched me, waiting for me to crawl in and grab it. I stood there, feeling a sense of unease as my gaze shifted back and forth between him and the truck. Then, I noticed a small but significant detail: the handle on the inside of the door that he was holding open was missing. It didn't require much intelligence to deduce what this meant. Instinctively, I began to retreat from him, my steps quickening as I hurriedly made my way to my car. He shouted for me to return, but I quickly accelerated. The man hurriedly got into his truck, but instead of pursuing me, he drove off in the opposite direction. There is no question that if I had crawled into his back seat, he would have forcefully closed the door, trapping me inside with no way to escape. It was clear that it was a dangerous setup. Unfortunately, all I had was his email to send to the police, but it couldn't be traced. I can only hope that nobody else falls into his trap. Gets caught in a chilling Craigslist deception. I've checked multiple times since then to see if his ad was back up for the PC, hoping to catch him and report him to the authorities. However, I haven't come across anything yet. It's possible that he's using a different alias and attempting to scam people with a different item. My suggestion would be to steer clear of Craigslist. I was browsing through Craigslist to search for a condo or a room in a house to temporarily reside in for a few months. Unlike most conventional apartments that only offer 1-year leasing terms, Craigslist was teeming with private owners who were renting out their places or rooms. Not only were these options usually more affordable, but the owners were also more open to negotiating the length of the lease. I had approximately a month to conduct my search, and during that time, I explored several options. However, at the last minute, all of them fell through. Eventually, I stumbled upon another place that seemed quite similar to the previous ones. It was a room available for rent in a home located just 20 minutes away from my location. The individual who listed it happened to be a young person of 22 years. After reaching out, we exchanged texts for a few days before finally scheduling a time for me to view the room. However, when I arrived at the street where his address was located, my excitement dwindled. The houses appeared dilapidated and neglected, with overgrown yards and junk scattered across the front lawns. It seemed like this was the best one could afford in this area. Despite my reservations, I decided to give it a chance and parked in the driveway. Unfortunately, the house looked just as neglected as the others. Undeterred, I stepped out of the car and pressed the doorbell, only to find that it didn't work. I could hear heavy footsteps approaching from the other side. There was an unsettling pause that seemed to last forever before he finally opened the door slightly, revealing only half of his face. Nervously, I smiled and answered his question about my name. He then opened the door fully and invited me inside. The man was tall and somewhat thin, with shoulder-length hair and visible tattoos on his neck. It was clear that he was older, possibly in his mid-30s or even older. I found myself already inside the house. Following him through the hallway, the man was moving at an incredibly fast pace, as if he wanted to show me everything in a hurry. He was talking non-stop, making it difficult for me to process the situation or fully grasp its strangeness. The kitchen had seen better days, with its worn-out appearance and cabinets that were barely holding on to their hinges. He didn't linger there for long, quickly making his way into the next hallway. 2 doors stood before him, and he approached the first one, turning to address me. "This will be your room," he said as I cautiously stepped inside. The man motioned for me to take a look around. In that brief moment, I managed to collect my thoughts and decided it was best to proceed with the tour, despite my growing unease. However, before I could fully process my decision, the man's expression darkened and his anger became palpable. Without uttering a single word, he began to approach me, his intentions unclear. I swiftly retreated as he matched my speed and began advancing more rapidly towards me. I quickly raced down the hallway, my heart pounding as I hastily made my way out of the house. The sound of him stopping at the front door and forcefully slamming it shut echoed in my ears. I couldn't help but berate myself for ever stepping foot into that place, knowing deep down that something was amiss. Although nothing technically occurred, every sign pointed towards a horrifying outcome. From that moment on, the mere thought of using Craigslist again filled me with an overwhelming sense of terror. Living on the East Coast, there's a plethora of homesteads and off-grid cabins scattered throughout the area. Many of these properties, although not completely off-grid, are situated in remote locations with vast expanses of land, often exceeding 40 acres. It is customary in this region to purchase second-hand tools and equipment from neighbors or other locals. At the time, I found myself engaged in construction work on my property and required a flatbed trailer for my truck to transport additional materials from hardware stores. These trailers can be exorbitantly priced, but fortunately, due to the prevalence of such trailers in the area, there is a substantial market for used ones. I decided to browse through Craigslist, hoping to find what I was looking for. Surprisingly, there were quite a few options available. I reached out to several sellers, but unfortunately only one of them responded. Thankfully, we were able to arrange a convenient time for me to visit. What I knew before starting this venture was that his name was Devin, and he possessed what I required. This was a routine occurrence in this area, something I had done countless times before, so I had no concerns. I embarked on a journey of approximately an hour from my residence, traversing mostly national forest roads until I arrived at his residence. The driveway resembled those commonly found in this area, a narrow gravel path leading into the depths of the woods. I proceeded through it and parked in front of his modest and compact house. The decrepit wooden cabin emerges from the dense forest, standing alone in a small clearing. As I approached the property, something immediately caught my attention. There was no sign of a flatbed trailer anywhere. Considering its size, it couldn't have been easily hidden. I assumed that perhaps it was stored in a garage or shed at the back of the property. Parking my car on the grass, I stepped out and waited for a moment, hoping the owner would come out to greet me. When no one appeared, I made my way to the porch and knocked on the door. As I waited, it was impossible to determine if any of the lights were on inside. The windows were concealed by curtains, and the sun was slowly setting, casting an eerie atmosphere. It was difficult to determine the situation after waiting for a full minute. No one had come to the door, and I began to wonder if nobody was even home. Suddenly, I received a text from Devin, instructing me to go around to the back of the cabin where he had the trailer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, but I also considered the possibility that I might be surprised out in the backyard. As I strolled around, I couldn't help but take in my surroundings. The moment I glanced around the corner, all I could see were towering trees. Continuing my walk, I paused by the side of the cabin right before reaching the back. To my surprise, there was no open space behind the cabin, only an endless expanse of woods stretching as far as the eye could see. Feeling a sense of unease, I decided it was time to head back to my truck. However, out of nowhere, I caught a faint sound coming from behind me. I turned and scanned the woods, but couldn't spot anything. It seemed like someone or something was approaching from just around the corner. I continued walking, my pace quickening, as I heard loud footsteps pushing through the grass behind me. I only caught a fleeting glimpse of the individual rushing towards me before I swiftly made my way to my vehicle. I'm not sure if he surrendered immediately or had alternative plans, but when I entered and glanced back at the cabin, the man had vanished. I swiftly departed from the scene and made my way to the closest town, where I promptly reached out to the authorities. The situation was quite unsettling. Surprisingly, the state had no knowledge of any cabin constructed on that land, which was supposed to be unoccupied. Upon investigation, it became evident that the cabin had been abandoned, with no indication of any intention to sell me anything. It became clear that the individual I encountered had ulterior motives, possibly with harmful intent. My suspicion is that he was lurking along the back wall of the cabin, waiting for an opportunity to ambush me. Fortunately, I had a sense that something was amiss and decided not to venture all the way back there. It's hard to say what might have happened if I had. Back in 2013, when I was 22 years old, I decided to sell an old computer that I had. It wasn't in the best condition, so I didn't think it was worth taking to a shop However, I believed that someone else might still find some use for it. Craigslist was the only platform I was familiar with for posting and selling items. It seemed like a convenient site where locals could find good deals. I had confidence in the safety of my neighborhood, so I didn't hesitate to list my PC on the site. Within a day, I received an email from someone willing to pay me the listed price, assuming it worked as I assured him it did. I assured him he could test it out when he picked it up, and we agreed to do the exchange the following morning. He introduced himself as Cameron and promised to send me an email when he was on his way. The next day, I woke up early and patiently waited until 11 o'clock a.m., the time he was supposed to show up. I was expecting his email to confirm his arrival, but it never came. By 11:15, with no email or any signs of him coming, I decided to open up the blinds and watch TV while keeping an eye outside. Casey, my anxiety, started to creep and appear out of nowhere at around 11:45. I caught a glimpse of a car creeping down the road. It inched closer and closer to the front of my house, finally halting right at the curb. Frantically sprinting, convinced that they were right behind. I paused the TV and waited, but several minutes passed without any movement or the car turning off. Then, out of nowhere, they abruptly turned back onto the road and drove away. I rose from my seat and approached the window, gazing out at the road with a sense of unease. A perplexing sight caught my attention, leaving me bewildered. Uncertain if it was Cameron or a mere stranger who happened to halt there, I swiftly shut the blinds, seeking solace in the darkness. In an attempt to clarify the situation, I reached out to Cameron via email, inquiring about his arrival. However, to my dismay, no response ever arrived. After an hour of fruitless waiting, I decided to abandon my anticipation and carry on with my day, pushing the peculiar incident to the recesses of my mind. I had a satisfying lunch and later enjoyed a delicious dinner. Feeling tired, I decided to retire early at 9 o'clock p.m. since I had an important work day ahead. Falling asleep swiftly, I was startled awake sometime later. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was only 11 o'clock, a mere 2 hours since I had drifted off. Hoping to resume my slumber, I closed my eyes once more, but my efforts were interrupted by a barely audible thump. Causing my eyes to snap open again, I lay there in silence, my senses heightened, straining to catch the sound once more. Moments later, it echoed through the house again, originating from somewhere below. It was an unfamiliar noise, one that filled me with uncertainty. Concerned that there might be an issue with the house, I mustered the courage to rise from my bed and venture into the hallway. With each step, the sound grew louder. No longer a mere faint thud, but something much more unsettling. I cautiously tiptoed through the kitchen, my footsteps barely making a sound. As I rounded the corner into the back hall, I found myself peering down a dimly lit corridor. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house, seemingly coming from the far end. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the faint silhouette of a figure moving just outside the window. I felt a sudden jolt as my heart skipped a beat, followed by a loud thud that rattled the window. Startled, I instinctively took a step back from the mysterious figure. I stood still and faced the window, my heart pounding as the shadow gradually took shape. Their face pressed against the glass, their eyes locking onto mine. It was a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch on for minutes, although it was only a fleeting second or two. Without hesitation, they swiftly retreated and disappeared into the distance. I wasted no time and immediately ran to call the police. However, It was clear that they had managed to escape before anyone could catch them. Although it initially appeared to be a straightforward case involving the man from Craigslist, Cameron, it turned out to be far more complicated. There was no concrete evidence linking him to the incident, aside from the fact that it occurred on the same day I was supposed to meet him. I never discovered their true intentions, but I did notice that the bolt securing the window had marks on the outside, as if someone had tried to force it open. I never delved further into the matter and decided to avoid using Craigslist altogether. I joined Uber Eats during its rise in popularity in 2021. After being laid off from my previous job, finding employment quickly seemed nearly impossible. Taking a chance, I decided to give Uber Eats a try, hoping it would pay off. After a few months, I found myself enjoying the work, and the income was sufficient to keep me going. This occurred approximately a year after I began. I had developed a routine of sleeping in and staying up late, causing me to not start working until around dinner time, specifically 11 o'clock p.m. I still hadn't made enough to be satisfied for the night, so I continued taking pretty much any order that popped up. It was already 1 o'clock a.m. when an order came through that caught my attention. It was a grocery order from a 24-hour 7-Eleven gas station. Despite finding it peculiar that someone would need groceries from a gas station in the middle of the night, I still accepted it. I parked at the mostly empty gas station and entered the convenience store. Inside, I encountered a kind old man working at the register. After collecting the bag from him, I decided to grab a cup of coffee for the road. Back in my car, I settled in before backing out and hitting the road for the final stretch of my drive. However, it didn't take long for me to notice a car's headlights right behind me. Mind you, it was very late at night. It was late at night with hardly any cars on the road. I was confident that I would have noticed them before they got so close. After some consideration, I speculated that they might have been at the gas station, parked on the side of the building, and pulled out just as I did. I continued driving along the same road, heading toward the outskirts of town. Suddenly, I sensed something was wrong with my car. It was much bumpier than usual, and a loud scraping sound was coming from the right side. Within a minute, the situation worsened significantly. It became so bad that I had to pull over to the side before my car completely broke down on the road. I parked on the shoulder, surrounded by dense woods on both sides. As I glanced in the mirror, I noticed the headlights of the same car gradually slowing down and pulling in right behind me. Uncertain of what was happening, I made a swift decision to exit my vehicle and investigate the situation. I was filled with curiosity and a hint of concern, unsure of the intentions of the car behind me. I wondered if they were willing to assist me or if they had alternative plans. However, I realized I was trapped until I could solve this mystery. Frantically, I dashed to the opposite side of my vehicle and immediately spotted the issue. My right tire was completely deflated. It was utterly bewildering because I hadn't encountered any obstacles on the road. Typically, flat tires occur gradually, not with such abruptness. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a peculiar gash on the side of the tire that appeared far from ordinary. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening reached my ears, coming from the car behind me. A man emerged from the shadows and greeted me. "I'm fine, thank you," I called out, hoping to deter him from coming any closer. My unease grew as I realized the need to keep my distance. This whole situation felt incredibly unsettling, but the man continued to approach me. As he came within about 10 feet, I could make out his features more distinctly. He appeared to be an older individual with a wild combination of gray and black hair. He sported an untamed beard and dressed in simple attire, donning jeans and a hoodie. However, they were covered in stains and grime. He approached my car and offered his assistance with a big smile. I reiterated that I was fine, but he found amusement in my predicament, glancing at my flat tire and then back at me. We endured a few uncomfortable moments of silence, during which the man maintained his smile. In an attempt to escape the situation, I fabricated a story about a friend coming to my aid. Despite declining his assistance multiple times, the man's smile slowly faded, and he shifted his attention towards his car, scanning the surroundings in an unnatural manner. At that moment, a surge of urgency coursed through me, compelling me to distance myself from this individual. I had no choice but to sprint off the road and dive into the dense forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The man pursued me relentlessly, his presence haunting the pitch-black woods. It felt like an eternity, but I managed to elude him after a few agonizing seconds. I didn't dare venture too far, still able to catch a glimpse of the headlights on the road. From my vantage point, I could make out the man's shadowy figure lurking near the cars. A few minutes later, he got in his car and left. By now, I had enough time to piece together that this was all a setup. It seemed that the Uber Eats order had been used to track me from the gas station, where my tire was likely slashed. However, I didn't anticipate catching him so easily. Surprisingly, his full name and everything on the app turned out to be real. I suppose he didn't expect us to connect it all back to the Uber Eats order. Nevertheless, the punishment wasn't severe, since he didn't physically harm me. He only stole a few things from my car. Although, if I had stayed on that road, who knows if I would even be here to share this story. Till I had some spare time this night, and fueled by a few coffees earlier in the day, I decided to channel this energy into going out and earning some money. I was delivering for Door, driving along the highway to my next delivery. It was late at night, and the roads were deserted. The peacefulness of the night was like a dream for any delivery driver. However, as I made my way, my phone suddenly started buzzing. It was the customer trying to reach me, but they hung up before I could answer. Since it only rang for a few seconds, I assumed it was just a simple mistake. If they didn't answer, I redialed their number and let it ring for a while. Disappointed, I shrugged it off and pushed the thought aside for the remainder of the drive. Exiting the highway, I entered a typical neighborhood with ordinary houses. I approached the house where my delivery was destined. I parked in the driveway and made my way towards the porch. I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. Uncertain if it was intentional or not, I cautiously tapped on the door and announced that I had arrived with their food. Suddenly, I heard a disturbing noise emanating from the hallway, a muffled thump that echoed my knocking. It sounded as if someone was forcefully banging on a door. Feeling a bit unsettled, I widened the front door and called out once more. Unsure of what to say, I simply repeated that I was delivering their food. After a few tense moments of silence, a man emerged from the back of the house. The man appeared visibly distressed and agitated, leaving me uncertain whether his unease was directed towards me or something else entirely. Without uttering a word, he made his way down the hallway and approached the doorway where I stood. However, my attention was diverted by the recurring thumping sounds emanating from further down the corridor. Perplexed, I glanced past the man, and he too turned to investigate before swiftly returning his gaze to me, acknowledging that I had also heard the unsettling noise. With caution, I inquired about his well-being, only to be met with his intense stare as he seemed to contemplate his next move. "Why don't you bring the food inside for me?" he demanded, his tone laced with nervousness. Anxious, I reluctantly picked up the bag, realizing the gravity of the situation. I felt a sense of threat, as if I had no choice but to comply with his request. However, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't be able to escape. As I hesitated, the man's expression grew increasingly disturbed, even angry. Suddenly, he snatched the food right out of my hands and forcefully slammed the door shut in my face. I stood there, shocked, as I heard his footsteps fade away down the hallway, and the ominous thumping ceased. At that point, I knew I had no other choice but to quickly leave the porch and retreat to my car. Chased after that one and ended up reporting the incredibly unsettling situation to the police. I think what ultimately led me to report it was the unsettling encounter with the man who insisted I enter his house. Without that incident, I might not have felt compelled to take any action. Unfortunately, the police informed me hours later that the man denied the presence of anyone else and refused their request to search his home. With no further leads, all that remained was speculation. I can't help but believe that something truly sinister was taking place, and that I could have been his next victim. However, it seems unlikely that we will ever uncover the truth. Are you familiar with delivering Chinese food for a local restaurant? I was just a teenager in high school at the time, and whatever job I got wasn't going to be for more than a year or two. I'd say this job was fairly typical to most first jobs or retail and food service jobs, because it had some slow and boring days, and some busy and stressful days. As the delivery driver, though, I was always thankful to not have to be working in the store and facing hordes of customers on this night. I began 6:00 p.m. It was a Friday, and I found myself working a late 6 to 12 shift. As soon as I clocked in, the non-stop delivery of orders began. For the next 2 hours, there was no time to catch my breath in between. By 8, the pace of orders started to slow down a bit, but I still had a few more to deliver before. I decided to take my lunch break and quickly gathered the 3 orders. My goal was to complete them before 9, but the second and third orders were located farther away. This is a typical occurrence in our town, which isn't densely populated. As I made my way to the second house, I successfully delivered the package and continued towards my final destination. It was located just 10 minutes away from my current location. However, upon checking the tag, I noticed that the payment for this delivery had not been made yet. During this drive, all I could think about was the much-needed break I would have afterwards. Going back and forth for 3 hours straight really exhausted me more than usual. When I pulled into the neighborhood at night and followed the GPS, I ended up in a back portion where the entire atmosphere suddenly and drastically changed. I ventured down a narrow road, its cracked pavement and potholes creating a treacherous path. On either side, small houses were hidden by overgrown bushes and neglected lawns. As I followed the GPS directions, I reached my supposed destination. However, to my surprise, there was no house in sight. I decided to turn on my brights, hoping to get a better view of my surroundings. In the distance, I could barely make out the silhouette of a small house, situated quite a distance away from the road. As I glanced at the overgrown grass leading up to it, I realized that there was actually a driveway, hidden beneath a tangle of vines and tall grass. If I hadn't spotted the house first, I would have never noticed the driveway, rendering it impossible for me to drive on. I parked the car and stepped out, clutching the bag tightly. As I made my way down the neglected driveway, The tangled vegetation seemed to close in around me. I was absolutely shocked by the dreadful state of the place. It's hard to fathom how someone could allow their driveway to deteriorate to such an extent. As I approached, the house came into view, and it was surprisingly tiny, almost resembling a trailer home. Unfortunately, it seemed to be in a similar state of disrepair as the driveway. As I approached the dilapidated house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The overgrown vines and dense bushes obscured the windows, giving the place an eerie atmosphere. Despite my unease, I pressed on, determined to fulfill my duty as a delivery person and deliver the order to this address. I suppressed my negative emotions and promptly knocked on the door. Almost immediately, I heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open, revealing a young woman. In the dim lighting, she appeared quite ordinary, which initially brought me a great sense of relief. However, within a few seconds, I couldn't help but notice that her normal appearance seemed strangely out of sync with the dilapidated state of the house. It was inconceivable that she could be so well groomed and put together. As these thoughts raced through my mind, she proceeded to open the screen door and spoke in an unsettlingly serene manner. A sense of fear enveloped me as I hastily retreated, realizing that I had to make a swift exit. Without wasting a moment, I turned on my heels and began my departure. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the side of the house, catching my attention. I glanced over and witnessed two figures emerging from behind the house, swiftly making their way towards me through the dense bushes. Panic surged through me, causing me to drop everything and sprint for my life. I pushed through the thick grass and entangled vines, desperately trying to escape. However, just as I reached the end of the driveway, I stumbled and fell to the ground, tripping over an unseen obstacle. I rushed forward, my heart pounding, as I heard their footsteps drawing nearer. I couldn't bring myself to glance behind me as I sprinted towards my car. As soon as I started the engine, the men abruptly halted and retreated to where they had come from. My entire body trembled with the lingering rush of adrenaline. I quickly made a U-turn and sped away. Naturally, I wasted no time in informing my boss about the incident. He strongly advised me to contact the authorities and file a report. It was a huge relief to discover that he wasn't concerned about the order at all. I had to place an order for my own safety, and looking back, it would have been a nightmare if things had gone differently. The police conducted interviews and a thorough investigation, but unfortunately, they were unable to locate any of the individuals. It turns out that the property I was on was actually state-owned, and someone had removed the trespassing sign and tossed it into the tall grass. The intentions of these individuals remain unknown, but it seems like the most logical explanation. I just hope that no one else has to experience what I went through. And if they do, I hope they can be as fortunate as I was to escape. I decided to indulge in a brief vacation to escape the monotonous surroundings of my flat and uneventful area. Seeking a change of scenery with mountains and lush forests, I opted for Colorado. However, my knowledge of the state was limited to the well-known towns, which proved to be quite expensive. Undeterred, I began exploring Airbnb options in smaller towns, although the choices within my budget were not as abundant as I had hoped. Eventually, I managed to find one that seemed reasonable and made the booking. The following week, I embarked on a road trip through the countryside, enduring a lengthy 10-hour drive to reach the Airbnb. I arrived at the town where I would be staying, and I must admit, my initial drive through it left me feeling quite uneasy. My expectations were not high, but this place turned out to be even more underwhelming than I had imagined. The sparse rows of houses were situated along a desolate and dimly lit road, with dilapidated wooden power lines barely holding on. In the darkness of the night, it almost resembled a deserted ghost town. During the day, the surroundings might have appeared less intimidating, but this initial impression was all I had to rely on. Fortunately, I managed to locate the Airbnb without any difficulty. I parked my car and made my way up the gravel path that led to a cul-de-sac, where my Airbnb and 4 other small homes were situated. After lugging my bags to the front door, I stepped inside. The space was quite compact, only 500 square feet, but I must admit that the layout was pleasant. I promptly dropped my belongings in the bedroom. I went to the kitchen to refill my water bottle and take a moment to relax before bed. As I stood at the counter, I heard a car approaching on the gravel outside. Curiosity led me to the window, where I saw a pair of headlights slowly entering. The car parked in front of the neighboring Airbnb, and the headlights turned off. Strangely, no one got out of the car. Deciding it was none of my business, I returned to the kitchen, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I sat on one of the bar stools, pulled out my phone, and responded to some messages, letting my family know I had arrived safely. After about 15 minutes, I called it a night and headed to the bedroom. I unpacked my belongings and began preparing for the evening when I suddenly heard the faint sound of a car door opening and closing outside. Following that, I detected the sound of footsteps approaching. Although it seemed like they were getting closer to my location, I assumed they were simply heading towards the neighboring house. The footsteps abruptly ceased, but I paid it no mind as I finished my preparations and climbed into bed. After about 30 minutes, I drifted off to sleep, undisturbed by any further noises. When I eventually woke up, I found myself disoriented and filled with a sense of unease. The silence of the house was only broken by the occasional creaking. I sat up, peering into the darkness of the room, trying to comprehend the source of my discomfort. Struggling to see in the dim light, my gaze eventually landed on the uncovered window, where a pair of eyes stared back at me. I felt a sudden surge of fear, causing my heart to race and my body to become completely still. After a moment, I noticed the figure moving away from the window. The sound of their footsteps was barely audible, and it didn't seem like they were leaving. I quickly jumped out of bed and rushed to get dressed. Suddenly, there was a noise coming from outside the bedroom door. I froze and listened intently as heavy footsteps moved away from right behind the door and hurried down the hallway. At this point, I was unsure of what to do, so I simply stood there, listening intently. I heard the footsteps go from inside the house to the gravel path and then down to the road. Eventually, a car started and drove away. After some time had passed, I cautiously opened the door and made my way down the hallway. As I noticed the front door left wide open and listened to the eerie silence of the night, I failed to detect the faintest sound of the man by my window as he made his exit. Although it seemed like he had vanished, I took immediate action by reporting the incident to a nearby police station, even though it was a 20-minute drive away. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up from the authorities, leaving me in the dark about the intruder's identity, motives, and why they chose to break into my home. I didn't stick around to uncover the answers. I reached my last stop before reaching my ultimate destination the next day. It was already late, and I felt incredibly drained from several days of non-stop driving. I retrieved my small backpack and entered the Airbnb, where I would be spending the night. It was a nondescript house situated off the main road, conveniently located along my planned route. I didn't do much investigation since it was just for a night, so all I needed was a bed to sleep in for 8 hours. As soon as I walked in, I immediately noticed an unpleasant smell. It wasn't particularly alarming, but definitely not enjoyable. It reminded me of a dead rodent under the house or mold in the ceilings. I quickly surveyed my surroundings, taking a brief glance into the bedroom and bathroom. However, I couldn't help but notice that the scent was much more potent in the bedroom compared to the living room. To be safe, I opted to keep my belongings in the main living area and made myself comfortable for the night on the couch. I grabbed a throw blanket from one of the sofa chairs and laid it out. Suddenly, a loud thump reverberated through the walls, causing me to startle. I felt more perplexed than frightened as I pondered the source of the deafening noise. It was difficult to discern which part of the house it originated from, as the sound reverberated through the walls. I cautiously ventured down the hallway, cautiously inspecting each room for any signs of trouble, but everything appeared to be in order. I wasn't entirely certain what to be cautious of, but I didn't think there was anything to be concerned about during my brief stay. I returned to the couch and resumed setting everything up before finally lying down. I took out my phone to do some planning for the next few days, but soon after that initial thump, I heard another one. The sound was eerily reminiscent of the initial one, reverberating throughout the walls. With a sense of intrigue, I rose from my seat and ventured down the hallway once more, determined to meticulously inspect every room. I flicked on the lights and carefully examined the walls and ceiling, but there was no sign of anything amiss. I began to consider the possibility that maybe a sizable branch was swaying in the wind, resulting in the unsettling noise on the roof. However, even that explanation appeared doubtful. I returned to the couch, reminding myself that I was only staying here for one night, and any issues were not my concern. I turned off the lights, laid down, and easily drifted off to sleep. The night was peaceful, and my exhaustion helped me sleep soundly. However, I woke up in an unusual manner. My eyes were still closed, and I had only partially awakened. I might have forgotten about it if not for what occurred next. A sense of unease filled my stomach as I opened my eyes, only to find a man standing directly above me, staring into my eyes. My entire body tensed for a brief moment before the man swiftly sprinted away from the side of the couch. And suddenly, I bolted out the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of his figure amidst the looming trees, but he vanished from my sight. I closed the door and then went to grab my phone, but my movement halted abruptly at the end of the hall. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something peculiar. Hanging in the middle of the hallway was a folding ladder leading up to an attic. Without wasting any more time, I immediately called for help. It became apparent that the man had been up in the attic that night. However, there wasn't much up there to indicate that he had been around for more than a day or two. It's likely that he was simply using the Airbnb as a place to live. Nevertheless, his actions were deeply unsettling. If I hadn't woken up, I shuddered to think what might have happened. At the time of writing this, an incident occurred only a few weeks ago. I had driven out to an Airbnb vacation cabin in a secluded, wooded area. My plan was to go on a backpacking trip with a few friends, and I intended to stay at the cabin for only 2 nights before continuing our adventure for the rest of the week. When I arrived and laid eyes on the place, I felt content. It was incredibly isolated, just a simple cabin which I found appealing. I parked my truck around the side of the cabin and unloaded my gear, bringing it inside. The interior was as expected small and not the most luxurious, but suitable for my needs. I paid for that night and quickly settled into bed, falling asleep easily. The next morning, my main objective was to explore the initial part of the trail where my friends would join me the next day. My main concern was to ensure that it was accessible and not too muddy from the recent rainfall. If it was, we would have to search for an alternative trail. I leisurely enjoyed a cup of coffee and relaxed until mid-afternoon. Later, I decided to take a walk down to the main road. The weather was pleasant and the trail looked clear and dry, so I didn't feel the need to venture too far. After hiking for about 4 miles, I turned back. It had only been an hour since I left, but as I approached the path leading to the Airbnb, I noticed a truck parked right in front. Curiosity piqued. I hastened my pace, uncertain of what was happening. Upon reaching the cabin, I went straight to the window of the truck, but to my surprise, it was empty. I scanned my surroundings, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I scanned the empty surroundings and found no one in sight. As I approached the front door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It remained securely locked, providing some relief. Stepping inside, I surveyed the interior, my heart pounding. It was evident that no one had entered, confirming my deepest dread. I meticulously checked every room, ensuring my worst fear hadn't come true. I opened the Airbnb app and reached out to the host, inquiring about their presence or the presence of someone else. As I anxiously awaited a response, I glanced out the windows, but there was nothing to be seen. The unsettling part was the lack of any visible paths or routes in this secluded forested area, with only a solitary cabin in the midst. Time dragged on as I continued to wait for a reply. With hours slipping away, I continued to scan the surroundings, desperately hoping for someone to return to their vehicle. However, as the sun began to set, the chances of that happening seemed increasingly slim, especially considering the time was approaching 8:00 p.m. I received a text indicating that I was the only one present, which was not entirely surprising. However, I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, there would be someone else here. After contemplating the situation, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease and decided it was best not to spend the night. As I began packing my belongings, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from the front of the cabin. I paused and listened intently as the footsteps made their way onto the porch and towards the door. Time seemed to stand still as I waited for a knock that never came. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously approached the door and peered outside. To my astonishment, there was a tall man standing on the doorstep, facing away from the door and gazing out towards the truck. It sent shivers down my spine to see this motionless figure. As I gazed into the distance, a chilling feeling washed over me, hinting at the presence of another being. Instinctively, I took a few cautious steps back, attempting to silently retreat into the adjacent room to call for help. However, my heart skipped a beat when, on my third step, a floorboard let out an ear-piercing creak. In that moment, I could sense the man lurking outside, his movements growing more restless. And then, to my horror, I caught sight of the doorknob turning. Trembling with fear, he struggled to open it. I hurriedly retreated to the bedroom, frantically dialing 911 as the figure outside persistently rattled the door and pounded on it, only to abruptly flee from the porch shortly after. The sound of the truck faded away. The police arrived at the cabin promptly, but their presence didn't prove to be particularly useful. That night, I decided to leave the cabin and seek refuge in a hotel instead. The fact that the man responsible for the incident was still at large left me with an unsettling feeling. I can't even begin to imagine what he might have been up to. The thought that truly sends shivers down my spine is pondering where he could have been during that entire time. Was he lurking in the woods or hiding somewhere near the house? After going through such a terrifying ordeal, I doubt I'll be staying in another secluded cabin anytime soon. It was the end of April, and I was preparing to move out of my home in Chicago to Nevada. To make things easier, I hired a company to handle the transportation of my boxes to the new house. Meanwhile, I decided to take a road trip down there and enjoy some restful stays at hotels or Airbnbs along the way. I planned to drive for 10 hours each day and stay overnight at different locations, allowing myself some time to relax during the journey. The total drive would take approximately 30 hours, so I decided that my initial stay would have to be in a remote area of Nebraska. I scrolled through Airbnb in search of an affordable option in Nebraska, where there wasn't much to explore. My main priority was finding a place to rest for 8 hours before hitting the road again. I stumbled upon a cozy one-story home with 2 bedrooms, even though I didn't require the extra space. The price was incredibly enticing, making it a great deal, although I didn't really mind the extra space. I did find it a bit peculiar that they only displayed pictures of 1 bedroom. However, it didn't really affect my decision, so I went ahead and booked it for the next night. The next morning, I packed up the rest of my belongings and set off on my drive. I left a bit later than planned, but I didn't think it would be a major issue, aside from having to drive in the dark for a few hours. If you've ever driven through Nebraska, you would know that it's quite uneventful. There are long stretches, hundreds of miles long, with hardly any buildings in sight. A couple of hours after dark, I arrived at the Airbnb. It was located off the long, empty road I had been on, down a short gravel path. Initially, I felt a bit let down as the exterior appeared much more dilapidated than what was depicted in the pictures. I reminded myself that I was only staying for a few hours just to sleep, so it didn't matter too much. I grabbed a couple of my bags and headed to the front door. Usually, the owners leave the key in a key box and give you the password, but the store had no key box. In fact, it actually had no luck at all. It was one of those plain doorknobs you'd usually see on a closet door. I began to feel a slight sense of unease, but with no other choices available, I reluctantly opened the door and cautiously entered. To my astonishment, the interior was surprisingly pleasant. Despite its small size, the living room and kitchen were tastefully furnished and appeared to be well maintained. I entered the first bedroom and noticed that it lacked a lock, but luckily the second bedroom had one. I decided to unpack in there. However, something about this bedroom gave me an eerie feeling. Right in front of the bed, there was a small old doorway measuring about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. I even took a picture of this peculiar doorway in the room. The more I stared at the door, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't bear the thought of staying in a room without a lock. Out of curiosity, I attempted to open it, only to find it locked from the other side. I rationalized that it was likely just a storage space for cleaning supplies or extra towels, but nonetheless, the store gave me an eerie feeling. I was getting quite exhausted, so I only unpacked the essentials for the night and began preparing for bed. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up to the sound of a gentle tapping coming from the edge of the bed. It was barely audible, but the entire house was eerily quiet except for the tapping sound. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand and hastily switched on the flashlight, directing its beam toward the edge of the bed. The tapping abruptly ceased. I'm not usually one to be easily frightened. I may get spooked or uneasy, but fear rarely takes hold of me. However, there was something about that tiny doorway at the edge of my bed, in that moment, that truly terrified me. I leapt out of bed, switched on the lights, gathered my belongings, and hurriedly fled the house as fast as I possibly could, all while the darkness outside still enveloped me. As I was backing my car out of the gravel path, the visibility was poor. However, something caught my eye, a figure lying on the ground behind the house. A sense of unease washed over me, prompting me to drive away quickly. After about 30 minutes, I decided to pull over and inform the owner of the house about the possible intruder. I sent a text message urging him to call the police. Continuing my journey for a couple of hours, I eventually found a small town and parked in a grocery store parking lot to get some rest. The events at that Airbnb still remain a mystery to me. The most unsettling part was discovering that my message had been read shortly after I sent it, yet the owner never responded.